All right, welcome back. Today, we're diving into one of humanity's biggest and most profound taboos, human cannibalism. It's one of those things, right? It's horrifying, but also strangely fascinating. But the real story? It's way more complex and, honestly, surprising than you'd probably think. So you always hear it called mankind's oldest taboo. But is that really true? I mean, for something we see as so completely wrong today, it's kind of wild to learn that it was surprisingly common in many different cultures for a whole lot of different reasons. So today, we're going to challenge that whole idea. Okay, first things first, let's get on the same page. What are we actually talking about here? The fancy term is anthropophagy, but really, it's just the act of humans consuming other humans. Starting with that simple definition helps us cut through all the myths and get to what was really going on.
Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll get into the why, the core reasons behind it. Then, we'll look at the huge difference between eating your own people versus eating your enemies. After that, we're going to get into some really unexpected reasons for the practice. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at all the myths, the prejudice, and the reality of this whole thing.
All right, so to even begin to wrap our heads around this, we have to start with the most basic question. Why? Why would people do this? Well, anthropologists usually put the motivations into three big buckets. It's a pretty simple framework, but it really helps us see that not all cannibalism was created equal. Okay, the first one is probably the one you've heard of, survival cannibalism. This is exactly what you think it is. It's what happens in the absolute worst case scenario, under the threat of starvation. You've probably heard the stories, right? The infamous Donner Party trapped in the mountains, or the survivors of that Andes plane crash back in 1972. These are just heartbreaking situations where people were driven to do the unthinkable out of a sheer will to live. But then we get to the second category, and this is where it gets a lot more complicated. This isn't about desperation. This is what we call institutionalized cannibalism. And what that means is it's a learned, accepted, sometimes even required part of a culture. It was often tied up in rituals and warfare or deeply held social beliefs. And then finally, there's the third type, pathological cannibalism. This is by far the rarest, and it's probably what a lot of us think of thanks to pop culture, figures like Jeffrey Dahmer. This is done by individuals, and society sees it as a crime or a sign of a very serious mental disorder. It's really important to draw a line between this and those culturally accepted practices we were just talking about. Now, even within that survival category, there's a huge, huge difference to understand. There's necrocannibalism, that's eating someone who's already died. But then there's homicidal cannibalism, that's killing someone for food. And this distinction, it became this massive legal issue in a famous 1884 court case that actually outlawed the so-called custom of the sea, where sailors who were shipwrecked would sometimes draw straws to see who would be sacrificed. Okay, so we've got a handle on the why. Now let's switch gears and talk about the who. Because who you're eating, well, it completely changes the meaning of the act. When we talk about those planned cultural practices, they basically fall into two big buckets. Endocannibalism, that's eating someone from your own group, often as a respectful funeral rite. Then you have the complete opposite, exocannibalism. That's eating an outsider, an enemy you captured in war. One is about respect, the other is about total domination and humiliation. Yeah, I know. Hearing cannibalism and act of affection in the same sentence is just bizarre to our modern ears. But for some cultures, like the Fore people of New Guinea, this was a deeply meaningful part of grieving a loved one. It was a way to keep their spirit alive, to literally incorporate their essence back into the family, or to help guide their soul to the next place. All right, now we're going to venture beyond survival and funerals and get into some of the most surprising and honestly kind of strange reasons for cannibalism. This is where the story takes a really interesting turn. Okay, get this. For hundreds of years, right here in Europe, medicinal cannibalism was a thing. A big thing. Doctors would literally prescribe medicine made from ground-up human skulls or blood or fat to cure diseases. And the hypocrisy is just wild, right? Europeans were doing this while calling people in other parts of the world savages for their practices. Other reasons included sacrificial cannibalism, like with the Aztecs, or even just gastronomical preference. Some people ate human flesh simply because they liked the taste, calling it the flesh that speaks. But okay, let's be practical for a second. Was it actually nutritious? Well, an archaeologist actually did the math.
A single adult male body has roughly 126,000 kilocalories. To put that in perspective, that's enough energy to feed a group of about 25 people for more than 2 days. So yeah, from a purely survival standpoint, it makes a grim kind of sense. And it wasn't just about getting enough calories to survive either. We have all these historical accounts from different continents that talk about culinary preferences. I mean, actual delicacies. Things like the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet were often considered the best parts. And in war, eating an enemy's heart or liver wasn't just about food. It was about absorbing their power, their courage. This was a complex system, not just mindless eating. So a fair question at this point is, how do we actually know any of this for sure? Because the whole topic is just packed with controversy, prejudice, and a ton of debate. It really makes you question everything you read. And this is maybe the most important piece of context. Accusing a group of being cannibals was an incredibly powerful tool for colonizers. If you could label a people as man-eaters, you could paint them as less than human. And that made it a whole lot easier to justify conquering them, enslaving them, you name it. So we have to be super careful with those old historical reports. This whole skeptical view really came to a head in 1979 with this book, The Man-Eating Myth by William Ahrens. He basically argued that there was no real proof of institutionalized cannibalism anywhere. He said it was all just rumors, hearsay, and racist propaganda used by powerful groups to put down weaker ones. It was a huge deal, and it completely shook up the world of anthropology. But in the years since that book came out, the pendulum has swung back. While everyone agrees Ahrens made a great point about being critical of sources, the evidence that's piled up since then from archaeology, from genetics, from ethnography it's overwhelming. So today, the general consensus is that, yes, the accusation was definitely used as a weapon, but the practice itself, it was absolutely real in some places, at some times. So if there's one thing to take away from all this, what is it? It's that there really is no single thing called cannibalism. We should probably talk about cannibalisms, plural, because surviving in the mountains is not the same as a funeral rite in New Guinea, which is not the same as warfare in the Amazon, which is definitely not the same as taking a cure in the old-timey London. Every single one has its own story, its own meaning. And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about. If this thing we consider the ultimate taboo wasn't always off limits, what does that tell us about our own rules? About the lines we draw in the sand for what's human and what's not? It's a pretty powerful reminder that our ideas of right and wrong, of what it means to be human, they're not set in stone. They've changed a lot over time, and they're different all over the world.